Everybody, welcome to the channel. Tyler here. I'm joined today by Christopher Golden, an author and the editor of The End of the World as We Know It. It is tales from one of my favorite books of all time, Stephen King's The Stand. And he is kind enough to join us today to talk about this brand new release. And Christopher, this is some craziness. It's coming out almost 50 years after the original release of The Stand, and over 30 original stories set in that world. So you called Stephen King the narrative voice of your youth.
Yeah.
What does The Stand mean to you?
So we should also say that I'm co-editor of the book with
That's
Brian
right.
Keene, and Brian and I are the same age. Our birthdays are about 2 months apart, or a month and a half apart, and we both read this book probably at age 12 or 13, and both of us have had it as our favorite novel ever since then. For me, it's not the first Stephen King book I read, but it is the one that definitely changed my life, like the trajectory of my life, in the sense that, the humanity of it, the storytelling of it, the depth of its, Americana and its 20th centuryness. It's just hard to to define it, but it definitely just got into my brain in a way that no other book ever really has. And it's been my favorite book for I don't know, 40 something years at this point.
Yeah, and same for me. I mean, there are few books in my life that I've read, and at the end, it's like I have to sit there and just be like, wow, and think about it for a little bit, because there's so many stories and so many layers going on in this book, and it really is an epic. And so 100%, but a project like this, so The End of the World as We Know It, this is a massive project. So between right between you and Brian, it's not just you involved in this, but you have over 30 authors who all have their own projects and lives going on. So how does a massive project like this come together?
I mean, it starts with just, sitting down with Brian on the phone or on Zoom and just making a list. Horror is healthier and stronger right now as a genre than it's ever been. Probably will never be this popular again. And which is something I thought I would never say, that we get to this place. And what that means is that we have such a deep bench right now. The breadth and depth of what horror as a genre is giving us to read right now is incredible. So, we could have had 100 stories. So the big task at the beginning was making a list of who we were going to ask in what order. And, we wanted to make sure that we had mainstream writers, horror writers, indie press authors, diverse voices, just really spread it out, body horror writers, and quiet horror, just really get, and also to go to writers who are not horror writers at all, but who we know were hugely influenced by King and by this book. So it was a long process, and then it was inviting those people, and it will not surprise you to learn that we had very few passes on it.
What you mentioned kind of the renaissance of horror right now, and I think that's true both in not in literature and on the big screen and other forms of entertainment. What do you attest that resurgence to? Do you think there's anything causing it, or is it just a cyclical thing?
I mean, I think it's a cyclical thing. I certainly think it's societal as well. The darker the world gets, weirdly, people turn to two things. They turn to comedy and they turn to horror stories. And I think it's because, if you're reading a horror novel, or, that you close the book, and if you're watching a horror movie, you can leave the theater. It's controllable. I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is, try to say this succinctly, but in the 1980s, when horror had its first real golden age, um, there weren't a lot of horror writers, and so when horror got really popular, and editors and publishers had to sort of fill their ranks with more horror to feed the desire for it among readers, they ended up buying a bunch of crappy books because there weren't, there were people who were just like, wanting to earn a paycheck, and no disrespect to that. But a lot of crappy books came out. So when horror crashed, it was partly because people were loving it, and then they kept reading it, and they were like, well, maybe I don't love this as much as I thought I did, because I don't like the last 3 books I read. The general public started seeing horror in terms of like Friday the 13th and all the various ripoffs thereof. And again, love Friday the 13th, but the general public felt like that was what horror was. And so when horror started to come back, when it started to make a resurgence, and I tracked that to the release of Joe Hill's short story collection, 20th Century Ghosts, I think was like the beginning. And then Heart-Shaped Box by Joe, and then A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. And it kept going from there and snowballing, and the fan base was like, wait, I love this stuff. And it started to spread to people who didn't think they liked horror. And so when publishers started to buy more of it, this time there were 30 years of writers who'd been writing in the indie press, who'd been, honing their skills and getting better at it. And they were casting the net wider, so it wasn't just, middle-aged white guys who wanted to write about inheriting your dad's house in Maine. So now you had all these different voices, all of these different people who had been working and getting better for a long time. So this time we were ready for horror to have a surge of popularity. And so when I say we have a deep bench, that's what I mean. Like, that deep bench wasn't there 30 years ago, and it's there now.
Awesome. So you said you didn't have many passes on the book, and you have some incredibly talented authors writing in this book. And so creative process wise, like, what does that look like? How much are you in collaboration with them on stories? How much is it on them? Because like you said, you have a lot of people from different subgenres of horror itself. So what does that look like when it's sort of coming together?
Well, it's first of all, we kept the guidelines very simple. The guidelines were you have to tell us sort of where in the timeline it falls. You're going to do a story set during the outbreak or after, during the gathering. So figure out where it would fall, so we could kind of have a mix. Beyond that, we just told them, you can have dreams about Mother Abigail and Randall Flagg, but you can't otherwise use any of the characters as primary characters in the stories. And there's one exception, and we got permission to do that. And we did that for a lot of reasons, but mostly because we didn't want the pastiches and the dedications and if people were able to write their Larry Underwood story, it would read a lot more like, fanfic, I think. And so what we wanted was the real stories from the heart, like these people are influenced by King and by The Stand. We want the influence rather than an imitation, So that was part of the process. As far as working with them, it depends on the author, it depends on the story. Some stories came in and they were basically ready to go, or just with a few minor edits. But as an editor, you have to also not be afraid to go back and say, this isn't working, and here are our suggestions. And there were some like that as well. There was one author that I went and said, this is the story doesn't really work, and this is going to be a big stage to perform on. So maybe do something different. And the result of that was phenomenal. So we just had, I don't know, it differed from author to author, but that's the fun of doing an anthology, frankly.
I guess one of the things I loved about it too is like the stories are very different. So there's some really chilling stories like Across the Pond I found to be, and then there's some very human ones like C. Robert Cargill's story, that where you see people who might not have been friends finding this bond together over movies and facing danger together, and then one of the characters choosing, I'm not going to go where these dreams tell me to go. I'm just going to pass and all of that. And I think that's great. And I've always wondered reading The Stand, and I mean, just for your take on this, like, I think if you ask most people, they would say, if I was in that situation, I'd be having Abigail dreams. Right. But in the book The Stand, one of the spies in Vegas sees that there's a lot of just otherwise really nice people here, right? Like they're totally fine. It's just, they've maybe been influenced by something different. What First of all, which dreams do you think you'd be getting? And then second, like, what do you think the influences are
I
there?
think you know, I think, well, so first of all, I think it's important to remember that most of the people had both of them visit their
Yes.
dreams, right? Um, and it was about which one had more allure, right? And so I think that the people who responded to, I think we're seeing right now in this country, like, who responds to promises of strict order, with threats of violence to back them up, and who responds to sort of freedom and individuality. And so, like people who were drug addicts would go to Flag, but also people who didn't want, who wanted to get rid of drug addicts would go to Flag, right? So it was a very interesting thing. I think a lot of the people who went to Flag who might not have been otherwise bad people may have just been weak people. People who wanted to be led, people who didn't want to make decisions for themselves and were content to let other people make decisions for them. Um, and you see that throughout the book. So not everybody who ends up in Las Vegas is a villain at all. Um, yeah.
And that leads me kind of into the next question. So it's been almost 50 years and the world has changed. On top of that, we just had a pandemic of our own just a few years ago. So reading End of the World as We Know It hit a little differently than reading The Stand the first time, just with that recent knowledge of real life experience. So how do you think, or maybe some instances of how our world today has changed or at least affected how the story is told in this anthology versus the original novel?
Honestly, and it's funny, it's hard to talk about these themes in the book, both the original and this book, without sort of venturing into political territory. And it's not my intention, but it's impossible to answer a question like that without doing it. I feel like so much of King's original story has turned out to be incredibly prescient, and and that there are so many, 10 years ago, there are so many questions that you could ask. Well, would you ever think that Americans behave this way or that way? Um, you could point to The Stand and say, do you think people would behave this way, et cetera, et cetera? And most people would have said, no, of course not.
Right.
But we see it every day now,
Mm-hmm.
and so it is really interesting. I think that the original novel's themes and the presentation of the choices that people make in the book is more pertinent to 2025 than it was when it was originally published.
I found the exact same. I reread the book before I read, the anthology, just to be fresh on it again, and it hit differently this time, right? It's hard, like you said, it's hard to overlook those things, um, but they're there, and it's hard to to turn away from that. So some of the stories are set years after the end of The Stand, which I think is awesome. I think it's great to see like what happens to the world going forward. How did the vision for what that world looks like sort of come together? Was that a collaborative process? Was that something the authors came up with and said, here's what I have in mind? What did that look
Yeah.
like?
Each author did their own thing. But I think it's important to recognize the hard work that Brian did. We sort of split up many of the tasks, and Brian's major task in this was he was sort of the lore keeper, I guess, in the sense that he really kept track of the timeline. Bev Vincent, who wrote a story for the book, helped us out with a really exhaustive timeline. And so Brian was able to say, okay, if you're going to be anywhere near where the trash can men blew up an oil refinery around that same time, you're going to have to see the smoke in the distance. That kind of thing on that level. But also, it meant that he and I would have conversations about, can this story by Sarah Langan and this story by Catherine Valente exist in the same continuity? And we tried to make as few suggestions for changes for that reason as we could. And for the most part, we didn't have to do a lot. People are having their visions, and I was saying, that there's no reason this particular story can't take place in one part of the country, as long as the other characters aren't stumbling into that part at that same time. So it was really interesting, but we wanted to just get to the heart of it. We wanted to have these authors be able to pursue their visions for this.
Nice. So you've said, Christopher, that you said, I guess repeatedly, that you're not doing any more anthologies, but here we are. And so what's the pull, do you think, to coming back and being an editor and part of one of these?
So I think it's inspiration. It's a thing that, in fact, Brian and I are talking about another one. It's not a Stephen King project. And I really enjoy the process. I've always been the guy who, even from childhood, if there's something that I loved and was excited about, I wanted everybody else to be excited about it as well. So that is why I edit anthologies, or why I have edited them, because this is a cool idea. I want to play with these other writers and see what they come up with, and then I want everybody else to read them and enjoy it for the same reasons that I'm enjoying it. And so that's really what brings me back to it, because typically it's a lot of work for very little compensation. But it's fun, it's cool. But I've also done a lot of them at this point. And so it's got to be something that really makes me go, that needs to happen,
Right. When you could tell in your introduction that this is sort of a passion project, and this is something that you had great love for, the original novel. And yeah.
This is, I could probably die now and I'd be fine.
So, when you read a novel like All Hallows, what's the difference between having just being the primary, writer on a project versus, having to have that creative shift to now collaborating and editing an anthology with a bunch of different writers?
I mean, it's completely different. But I've always been really collaborative. And I think people can do more than one job, and so when I'm writing a solo novel, it's very personal and very isolated and private, and I love that. But I also like to play with my friends and people I admire and people whose work I admire. And so I've worked in comics almost my whole career. I've edited anthologies most of my career, and I work on screenplays and things like that, which require you to work with other people, and it just comes back to that same feeling of wanting to enjoy things with people that you admire, or and sometimes you're having a conversation with your friend and you come up with an idea and you just say, we have to do that. So
so who's your favorite character in The Stand, and why do you think that is?
I go back and forth all the time. I love Tom Cullen as a character. I love Nick. I love Trash Can Man as a character for so many reasons. I understand him perhaps more than I should. But my favorite character is always going to be Stu. And I think it's because, I talk about this all the time too. Like my dad was not around that much when I was a kid. And then when I was 11, my parents got divorced. And so I always say I learned the difference between right and wrong from Marvel Comics. And so and from The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. And I always had a very strong sense of, standing up, no pun intended. And that's why Stu is the guy, he's the guy you want to be. He's the guy you hope you would be under those circumstances.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Awesome. What's your favorite King movie adaptation?
Wow, that is a really hard question. It's really hard to pick a favorite. I mean, I love the original miniseries adaptation of Salem's Lot. I love The Shining, even though Stephen King is not a big fan of Kubrick's vision. I love The Dead Zone with Christopher Walken. That's a great movie that people don't think about that much. God, I have to. I mean, Carrie by Brian De Palma. Come on, like there are some real classics. Modern wise, like if you think about just 21st century adaptations, it's Mike Flanagan's Doctor Sleep by far.
Yeah, I really
The
enjoyed that as
director's
well.
cut. The director's cut.
You and I are in the minority on that, I think, but it is. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, listen, if you watch the director's cut of it, Flanagan did such an extraordinary job of taking the novel Doctor Sleep and connecting it to Kubrick's version of The Shining in ways that made it phenomenal. And I'm sorry, but Rebecca Ferguson as Rose the Hat is stunning. I mean, she's amazing.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, again, there are so many bad adaptations of Stephen King's work that it's very easy to remember how many great ones there actually are. So
Yeah. What's your favorite horror film, or what are your favorite horror films in general?
favorite horror film of all time is John Carpenter's The Thing. Just it's my two favorite movies. Have always been, well, Blade Runner is my favorite film of all time, and The Thing is my favorite horror film of all time, and they came out the same day. Like that's a crazy, crazy thing. And I think anybody who could say that the '80s wasn't an immensely fertile time for pop culture and for genre film, you're crazy. Go look again. So though, yeah, but Carpenter's The Thing, and then I recently made a list of my favorite 21st century horror films. I mean, I go way back. I mean, the original Cat People. Like the original The Thing from Another World. Them with the giant ants. If you tell somebody about that movie and say it's a movie about giant ants who've been made giant by atomic radiation, they're going to say that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But if you show them the movie, they'll be like, that shouldn't be good, but it's really good. So there are all kinds of things that I love. But 21st century wise, The Descent, The Autopsy of Jane Doe. I mean, there's so many. My favorite favorite horror film of the last couple of years is Talk to Me.
Very nice. And then I guess to wrap up, if people want to get in touch with you or find you on social media, where can they go?
I'm super easy to find. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Instagram. And I have a website at christophergolden.com. People can email me from there.
Okay. And we'll have all those things up on the screen and in the description. So feel free to look Christopher up. And Christopher, thank you so much for taking time. The book is amazing. If you're a fan of Stephen King at all, please check it out. It's The End of the World as We Know It. It's fantastic. It's in stores. And like I said, if you like The Stand or King in general, you want to and need to read this book. So, Christopher, thank you again so much. And for bringing this work to life, because I thought the story, as amazing as it was done. And to have more is just a treat. So thank you again.
Thank you.
We look forward to hearing what's next from you.
Sounds good. Thank you.